Diary of a Man in Despair. Friedrich Reck. May 1937.
Reports of a new political scandal have spread across Germany. Percy Hafstengel, scion of the well-known Munich publishing family, and until now enfant gate of Nazism, has fallen out of favor. It happened quickly. One cold February morning, he boarded a plane ostensibly bound for Spain. In mid-flight, the plane went into a series of loops designed to throw him out of it, and when this failed he was set down, in the midst of a swirling snowstorm and with the temperature 10 degrees below freezing, somewhere in the forests of Thuringia, and wearing a business suit. He got back to Berlin, and found that his office there, he had been information officer for the entire foreign press, was closed. The English ambassador, Sir Eric Phipps, who had previously interceded in the Rome Putsch in favor of Brüning and Treviranus, the cabinet minister, helped him get away to England. The reason for this rather unusual method of obtaining a resignation from office is said to be that Hafstengel was much too critical of German intervention in Spain, and also that a film company of his infringed on Goebbels' territory. Another story is that he drank too much in a Paris café, and was overheard talking about a connection between Tukhachevsky and the others now involved in the Moscow trials and Himmler, and that this led to the uncovering of the whole plot. In any case, Hafstengel, with whom I dined at the Regina in Munich only a few weeks ago, and whom I consider a man of courtesy and breeding, is now in England. Since he knows the answer to the mystery that surrounds, or is supposed to surround, the burning of the Reichstag, Berlin fears the worst. Hafstengel's 80-year-old mother has been sent to London to bring him back, carrying with her the salvaguardia of the German government, and the special guarantee of her going in default thereof. In default. The Hafstengels are tied to Germany by every economic link, their assets are here, and they are open to whatever action the government may decide to take against them. So the mother went, but the son would not play the game, and declared that he knew exactly how much the word of a Hitler or a Göring was worth. And there this edifying little trifle rests for the moment. With her Arno Rechberg, I breakfasted at the home of Percy's sister, Erna. Erna hid Hitler after the Nazis' attempted coup at the Feldherrnhall years ago, and could therefore bear the title of Patroness of the Third Reich. Now, however, the lady is raging at Goebbels, whom she accuses of envy and personal rancor, and charges with an old matter so far known only in broadest outline. It seems that in the late autumn of 1933, at a time when she was living in an extremely isolated villa east of Munich, on the very edge of suburban Bogenhausen, her house was entered while she was away. She went to Herr Himmler about this, and he later informed her that the entry had been ordered by an official so high up no redress was possible, and further that it had not been her letters only they were after, but her life. He therefore declined to have anything further to do with the matter and urged her to move to the center of town. She followed this advice, and now told me that the official was Herr Goebbels, and that he had ordered the search for the purpose of obtaining certain letters which Hitler had sent her, these letters to be employed in case of emergency, as, for example, the loss of his post and consequent flight abroad, against his lord and master, Hitler. An amusing story, since our somewhat stunted great chief thus supposedly strove for the love of this generously proportioned lady, Erna Hafstengel, in contrast to Hitler, represents the typical Munich Bavarian. Thus we live in Germany today. With us at Erna Hafstengel's was a young Englishwoman, a type somewhere between archangel and model for a toilet soap ad. Her name is Unity Mitford, and her usual perch is atop the Obersalzberg, in the court of Herr Hitler. Her purpose is to become Queen of Germany, with the aim of bringing about reconciliation between Germany and England. This forceful lady, and Hitler, bon voyage. Meantime, I have been in Berlin, center of all diligence, activity, and perfection, by its own statement. In my humble opinion, however, it is like an immense machine, all sound and fury in producing nothing. I do not believe in any of it. I know all about telephoning with both hands and feet, about appointment pads on which every minute for the next 3 months is scheduled for engagements and conferences. I know all about production at any price, and the desperate hankering after a pseudo-Americanism. It is the viewing of all life as a kind of gigantic army barracks which has brought on us the aversion of the whole world. As long as this country allows itself to be represented by this basically hopeless city, we will go from one foreign policy disaster to the next. I do not believe there is any substance to the idea that people in Berlin work harder than elsewhere. They have a hysterical drive to keep moving, probably an indication of a flight from the knowledge of their own inner emptiness. I believe that it is the same kind of false front trickery that turns the slave driver of 2 barmaids into her director, the backyard shack of every housing project into a garden pavilion, and every discussion on how to cheat a customer on a shipment of dehydrated soup into a conference. I believe in what really has substance in Berlin, what is productive and really works, the workers of Berlin East, the streetcar conductors, the mail carriers and the truck drivers. I believe in the taxi driver, like a good and concerned father, who, when I told him the suburb I wanted him to take me to, warned me about the fare for the trip, and in a burst of Prussian thrift advised me to take the elevated. Oh, I believe in the grumpy soundness of the Berlin concierge, I believe in the kind of humor that placed at the foot of the statue of saber-waving Blücher. There's only room for one on this stove. What I do not accept is this disgusting dry rot which has set in here in the last 90 years, these females with their sunglasses, their yard-wide backsides, and huge bosoms, playing at being ladies, these her directors with their appointment books, in short, the busyness and officiousness of all these bookkeepers, patent attorneys and lottery ticket sellers with their triple-locked briefcases like embassy attaches, when all they are carrying about are 3 dried-out cheese sandwiches. What is most typical of Berlin is deception, functional form, without solidity in either materials or execution, mechanics' apprentices who are above mere careful workmanship, and at once declare themselves fully fledged inventors or builders, streamlined kiddie cars with brittle imitation leather, functionally constructed flashlights with inoperative connections, and the new functionalism, which would make desks and beds out of reinforced concrete, and is really infinitely less practical than the so-called romantic excesses of the past. And a few other items. Economy in construction and the junk called unfinished goods, the ersatz-wool suit which is not warm and cannot be cleaned, and that snake poison made of sulfur and sugar and treated by all the hellish arts of IG Farben, which is sold by the glass as wine in the restaurants of the West End, wine, this brew that is supposed to look and smell like the real thing, to have both body and flavor while costing next to nothing, which provides the unwary on the morning after with the legacy of a truly monstrous hangover. No, I do not believe that there are many cities in which as much time is lost in useless bureaucratic reorganization, rejoinders of, on the other hand, purposeless chatter, and directorial pontification as in Berlin. When I am called to Babelsberg to show my rough script, a film writer, a man of repute and titanic energy, told me recently, I find gathered around a large green table 7 elderly gentlemen who obviously all have high blood pressure and who all have boxes of pills handy on the table before them. These gentlemen are all enchanted with my script. Then, just as everything appears settled, out of the shadows springs a dramatist's apprentice in horn-rimmed glasses. This is a type perfectly aware of his own superfluity, and so expends vast efforts in an attempt to find something wrong, and thus provide at least the shadow of a justification for his paltry 300 marks a month. This gentleman rises to say that the script is certainly wonderful, but that such and such scenes might give offense to the pressure group organized by the German wallpaper manufacturers, and that such and such other place in the script would not be comprehensible to inhabitants of Mars, prospective civil servants, or stenographers who had not graduated from high school. The reply that whatever purports to cover every contingency actually covers none, has no effect. The signal has been given for the elderly gentlemen to awaken from their lethargy long enough to attempt to legitimize their own, much higher, salaries. Each now racks his brain to add his own, now, on the other hand, to the discussion. And so begins the nerve-wracking period of weeks of smoke-filled story conferences, telephone calls, breakfasts, and still more story conferences which is known to every author working at the Babelsberg studios, and which ends finally in the complete junking of the original script. The new version has carefully eliminated every natural association in favor of a super-clever artificiality. In accord with the principle, why have things simple when they can just as easily be complicated, an attempt is made to fly to the moon. Finally, all concerned are ready for a sanatorium, and the monstrous structure compounded of impotent intellectuality collapses of its own impossibility. There is a pause for a deep breath, and then the simple, sound, completely satisfying solution is found, in every detail, the same as in the original script. This fact is admitted amidst many apologies, tendered with hearty slaps on the back, and perhaps a certain faint embarrassment. The unfortunate part of it is that in the meantime the original impetus has been lost, and that 4 weeks of the 3 months assigned to making the film have been lost in useless discussion, weeks that must now be made up with frantic, hasty work. Isn't this Berlin? Isn't this the principle which has underlain all that has happened in this deeply hopeless city for the last 60 years, industry, the arts, and not least, statesmanship, as well? A general staffer told me recently about an experience of his during the hot summer of 1917 on the Balkan front. It was July, he told me, and we were under heavy pressure, so much so that sometimes we were no longer sure how we stood, when during a few minutes' time out for breakfast I was called to the telephone, the chief himself. I recognized Ludendorff's voice, and despite the distance I could hear quite clearly. Astonishing to hear the question over the receiver, coming from beyond the Vosges Mountains, the Danube, the Rhine, and down the slopes of the mountains of the Balkans, repeated over and over, "Are there strawberries there?" I truly did not know what our Lord and Master was referring to. Was he, I wondered, inquiring after the menus of our frugal breakfasts, or could it be that he was no longer all there? Finally, after a period of painful confusion I grasped what he was after. He had heard that the land surrounding our occupied positions was eminently suited to raising strawberries. Concerned as he was with the state of the German economy, and at the same time with providing suitable employment for German soldiers who might at the moment be idle, he had conceived the idea of having us plant strawberries, proceeds from the sale of which should then go to bolster foreign exchange balances. It did no good at all for me to protest that we were being heavily pressed by the enemy and needed every available man. He had to have his strawberries. And he got them, too. We had to withdraw troops urgently needed at the front to do the planting. We did it with great misgivings, and had vast trouble afterwards to close the gaps so created. He actually got his strawberry acreage and the next year a bountiful yield, which he intended to have preserved in Berlin and sold abroad. The crop was really first-rate, but when it got to Berlin it was completely rotten, fermented, and moldy. It had been shipped on the overtaxed railroads under heavy freight loads. All of it had to be thrown away. Thus my informant. Today, I dined at the little Italian restaurant on Anhalter Street, where I saw 4 higher-ranking SA officers, all thoroughly drunk, who kept yelling into the cars of the owner, who looked like a character in a Verdi opera, and at his Neapolitan waiters. The word they continually roared, on account of the newly concluded German-Italian Friendship Pact, was collaborazione, probably the only Italian word they knew. At the same time, behind me, another little scene, hardly less rich acoustically than the first, was being enacted. In this one, 2 ladies of the Berlin bourgeoisie, of the type described earlier, were deep in conflict over an evening coat which had fallen from the back of a chair to the floor. While the little Neapolitans watched, grinning, one of these ladies accused the other of deliberately throwing the garment down. At this, the second screeched, "I beg your pardon, madam. I am a German woman." And thus it goes in Berlin. At this moment, exhausted by the endless turning and clamor of this mill grinding on emptiness, I am back in my room in a hotel close to the Anhalter station. The place is furnished with the mass-produced junk of the years just before the war, and has walls that appear to be as thick as my finger. If I, here in my cell baked by the summer heat on the 4th floor, were for some reason to utter the word "no," even slightly louder than usual, I am certain that from the depths of the ground floor an oily baritone would respond in Balkan accents, "Ah, perhaps you will think it over." And so it goes in the city of Berlin. This is a place of formulas and stereotypes. The only things that bloom here have to do with numbers, columns, formulas, and patterns. And with it all, there is this repulsive poverty, which has nothing to do with simplicity, which is merely a cover for inferiority and stupidity. Sparse and skimpy is the motto of this land. When I was still in short pants, I read that Frederick the Great's grenadiers wore waistcoats that were not waistcoats at all but merely triangles of red cloth which had been sewn to their doublets. And whether this story is true or not, I see these triangular pieces of cloth everywhere, in big things and small. Appearance, artifice, a patched-on thing, and with it all the deeply ingrained idea of being something special. Why? Because they have the urge to rob and pillage, which is characteristic of all who live meanly. Germany is never satiated, with no sense of form or taste, lacking all idea of what comforts and pleases in life. It has just one ambition, for more. And when it finally has more than it can possibly use, it puts what is left to one side, and woe to him who touches it. A nation of pirates, making its forays on dry land, but always with Te Deums, for the greater glory of God or the faith. For there has never been a shortage of inscriptions to put on its flags in this land. Is this a Rhine Confederation intellectual speaking? Is this Bavarianism in the style of Dr. Sigel? No, this is Theodor Fontaine, claimed by this city as one of its very own, a Prussian pur sang, as they say. I can cite myself here. I, too, am of old Prussian stock, although my mother was of Austrian descent. I think back. My grandfather, who can be what his father was? Homson says, my grandfather was a reserved and cultured man who lived the contemplative life, read Christian Garve and Humboldt, and retired at 50 to spend his remaining years hunting and fishing in odium cum dignitate. He represented the last of the genuine conservatives, the true Junkers, wonderfully cultivated, widely traveled, and skeptical of all bombast, whether out of the mouths of Hohenzollerns, or, as the East Prussians derisively called them, Nurembergians. It was the generation of the Franco-Prussian War, returning bloated with success from that militarily most wonderful but in its effects most unfortunate of all German wars, that broke the form. By a series of rich marriages, they allied themselves with industry and finance, and so opened the way for both to influence the government on a scale never known before. Let no one counter that the same thing happened in England during the early Victorian period, and in France during the Restoration. The medicine was absorbed by England without ill effect, it was harmful for France, and it proved to be a deadly poison for this country, which can and must base itself on agriculture and a pastoral economy. In 1853, Bismarck, standing at the graves of the dead of 1848, could not even forgive the dead. Yet, 18 years later, in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, he helped make the national liberalism of these same dead the dominant ideology of Germany. Thus by his drive for industrial prosperity he undermined the foundations of the very state he had created. Bülow, whose coarse-grained memoirs I read recently, described the effects of Bismarck's policy with null tessieren net sate so quil tis, a quotation which of course throws a great deal of light on the tragedy of a Reich formed without regard to geography. The form, to use a Spenglerian concept, of this nation required that it avoid the expedients of industrial expansionism and capital investment. Everything that has befallen us since derives from the time when the Prussian oligarchy took industrial capital for its concubine. This is responsible for the breakdown of all the basic societal ties so necessary to a healthy Germany, and for making this a politically amorphous nation. Beginning with that time, a geopolitically based policy for Germany was tossed overboard, and foreign policy was increasingly geared to the export market. Result, the First World War, waged completely against geography. Even before this, there was the unmitigated cynicism with which, around 1840, a generation brought up in the atmosphere of the student clubs and Turnvater John threw overboard its entire spiritual heritage, the unbridled indulgence in dreams of a special, teutonically embroidered prosperity, a shallow and irresponsible concentration on one generation, an unheard of destruction of irreplaceable natural resources, of our cultural and ethical substance, a stockbroker's philosophy, already apparent in the 60s and 70s, which blocked out every thought about tomorrow. Thus the Wilhelms led our society into the disastrously shapeless kind of thing in which men of learning became racing drivers, bankers went in for breeding thoroughbreds, and cavalry lieutenants became absorbed in their industrial stocks and so lost themselves in the mob, became as faceless as the rest under the spell of the only banner that could have held this amalgam together, materialism. And thus sank into a godforsaken troglodytism, which I believe has presaged certain destruction for a civilization since the days of Caracalla. The ideal of the classless society as preached by Hitler is postulated on the limbless organism. But I believe that nature, which in its very beginnings was form itself, abhors nothing as much as the amorphous. I am writing this in a Berlin hotel which is about as quiet and discreet as a howitzer. At this moment, a lady on the floor below, whose name probably is Delinsky and who is certainly of the type I described earlier, is giving all the details of her divorce to her friend at the other end of the telephone. The windows are open, and all the spicy details are as though implanted in the still, hot air. Finally, whether I want to or not, I learn what drove her Delinsky prematurely out of Madame's arms. I hear it, and recall a parade of the League of German Maidens which I saw go past in the city yesterday, a procession of bowlegs and broad hips marching between the ecstatically ugly facades of a city in love with its own ugliness, an exhibition of joylessness, a declaration of war on everything that comforts and pleases in life. Pondering the great changes of the 19th century, and with this procession of females still in my mind, I realized that the moment, 70 years ago, Germany in its infatuation with prosperity agreed to let Prussia be its organizer and procurer, it did not merely go to the dogs, much worse, it went to the Delinskys, who inhabit this place, as well. Prussia is a state patched together out of bits and pieces. It was never intended to be a nation. To hold together the monstrous structure formed this way, the Prussians had to put all their energies into their military machine. As a result, no middle class, no patrician class, and no true caste of the learned could ever come into being, and therefore, immediately following the disappearance of that oligarchy of mixed Vandalkashub antecedents described by Fontaine, there rose to the surface that thoroughly un-German, that thoroughly colonial type which, when the men of the Holy Roman Empire were building cathedrals, was still busy tattooing green lizards around its belly button. The Elbe is a furrow in the landscape deeply significant in German history, and there are good reasons why certain species of birds and plants have never crossed from the left to the right bank of this river. For here, between the Elbe and the Vistula, is to be found the home of the Madonnas with the bowlegs previously mentioned, here, the breeding ground of this race with its eternal cry for more, the reservoir of all massman's repressed drives, the hatchery for all treaty breaches and the robberies masquerading as acts of state which Herr Hitler has committed these last 5 years, with no one daring to contradict him when he gave these as proof of his statesmanship. Here, then, is where the preference for the provisional and second rate was born. This disposition toward false front ersatz can be seen even in the Baroque trappings of the kings of Prussia, the gilded plaster of their palaces, accompanied by the demand, backed up by a gun, to please, if you will, be so kind as to accept all this as solid and definitive and fully valid. This, then, is where the eternal more originated, and the deification of the threadbare, the cult of the ugly, the gigantic fetishism which placed the statue of an Iron Will Hindenburg so that it towered over the trees of the Königsplatz. This is the place where the eye-bulging hatred against everybody who had more originated, the ceaseless eyeing of other people's property, the readiness to sudden banditry, and the drive to make this Prussian cult of the threadbare into the state religion of Germany, and following that of the entire world. And they will, if the other peoples prove recalcitrant, use their guns. I recall the story of the corporal who told his infantrymen at the entrance to the church not to lose valuable time in sitting around, dozing, but to hurry and get done, from the altar to the organ and from the priest out the door, so as to use the time to better advantage elsewhere. This kind of thing was tolerable as long as a great and completely Machiavellian king used the army pour l'honneur de l'épée. But armed might in the service of IG Farben, the waging of war for the propagation of economy in construction, rayon stockings, and the ersatz suit, is to become the scourge and plague of the world, the odium generis humani, in a world of abundance and plenty. Germany turned ugly, and malignant, and the center of the disasters that have been coming now at 25-year intervals, the day Bismarck established a Reich, and a nation began to be ruled by a colony, Prussia. And here I touch on the central political problem affecting Europe today. After the Prussian oligarchy, which was, at the very least, aware that it had responsibilities, disappeared, the men of Versailles were guilty of the incredible stupidity of dismembering Austria. After that, all that was needed was for Prussian greed to combine with a political condottiere, and the catastrophe which all of us knew was in the making was upon us. In southern Germany, the bitter battle being fought below the surface against the Nazis is at the same time a battle against Prussianization, and a defense of Germany's natural structure. This may be a German problem today, but tomorrow it will be a matter for Europe and the world to resolve. The time is fast approaching when Europe will have to decide whether it will let itself be engulfed by the grey wave, or finally defend its own heart from the drive for power of Prussianism.